Hi there, welcome to the National 5 History SQA Revision Support for the Forth Valley and West Lothian Regional Improvement Collaborative for March 2022. Most of the information from today's presentation can be found in the SQA Study Guide 2022. Our learning intentions for today are that we are learning about the key information relating to National 5 History for this year's SQA exam. This will involve some of the key information relating to the date and time of the exam, as well as the updated structure and the different question types that you will be dealing with throughout the paper. We will also be learning about the different approaches to dealing with the question types examined in the National 5 History paper. Now we're going to look at our success criteria. By the end of today's session, we want you to be able to understand the structure of the 2022 National 5 History question paper. We would also like you to be able to understand the best approaches for maximising your marks across the paper itself. This means looking at the different question types and possible approaches towards answering them. We would also be able to like you to manage your time effectively whilst answering your paper. This means that we will focus in on the timing allocations for each of the questions that you're going to be examined on. On the screen in front of you, you can see some of the SQA updated guidance that's been released to try and support you in this year's exam diet. For some courses, the SQA have published information on what broad topics, contexts or content will or will not be in this year's exam. For other courses, the SQA have published study guides to help you practice answering exam questions. This is going to be particularly useful in National 5 History, where a study guide has been produced by the SQA to help direct you around the different types of questions that you can expect to see in your exam. In a small number of courses, you will be allowed to prepare a short study note that you can take with you into the exam. This is not the case for National 5 History, and therefore you should make use of the study guide that the SQA have produced to support you. As part of today's session, you will see a number of symbols which will appear on the different slides as we progress through the presentation. You can see the symbols on the screen in front of you at the moment. The first symbol is asking you to listen. This means that you should be listening carefully to the information that is being shared with you. The second symbol is asking you to speak or to repeat any information that is being shared. The third symbol is asking you to read the information. This is going to be particularly helpful when we start looking at the approaches for answering your different question types. The fourth symbol is asking you to write or copy any important information which will help you. The fifth symbol is asking you to correct any work that you have completed as part of today's lesson. The sixth symbol is asking you to pause the video to complete the task. Remember that you can pause the video at any time if you would like to spend a bit more time looking at individual slides. The final symbol is asking you to watch. The information on this slide is very important for you to read and to make a note of. This slide contains the key date and time information relating to your exam. The National 5 History exam will take place on Friday the 20th of May. The time that it will begin, according to the SQA timetable, is 1 p.m. in the afternoon. It will last until 3:20 p.m, which means that your exam lasts for 2 hours and 20 minutes. The question paper itself is made up of 80 marks, and the number of questions that you will be asked to answer is 14. Just as a reminder, in your paper, you will be asked to answer one part from each of the 3 sections studied. You'll be asked to answer one unit from the Scottish section, one from the British section, and one from the European and World section. On the screen in front of you, you can see all of the different units that are assessed in the National 5 History course. For example, in the Scottish context, if you have studied Migration and Empire, when you receive your paper, you would turn to the Migration and Empire section and answer the questions from there. If you have then studied the British section and its Atlantic slave trade, you would turn in your booklet to the Atlantic slave trade questions. And finally, in the European and World context, if you have studied Russia and the red flag, you would turn to the Russian section and answer the questions from there. When you receive your question paper on the day, it's really important that you don't just dive in and start answering all of the questions that you see. Use the index on page 2 of the question paper to make sure that you're answering the correct part. As you can see on the screen, Section 1, the Scottish context, shows 5 possible units or parts that you may have studied. If you have studied the era of the Great War, for example, you would turn to pages 12 to 13 and answer all of the questions on pages 12 to 13. Remember to read the questions carefully. Why don't you pause the video at the moment and look at the link that you see on the screen so that you can see what an exam paper will look like and how you could or should use the index. For this year's exam, the SQA have made some slight modifications to how the paper will look for the British and European and World sections. The Scottish section, or context, remains unchanged. In this section of the paper, you should answer all of the questions on the unit that you have studied. For example, if you have studied the era of the Great War, you should answer all of the questions on the era of the Great War. For the Scottish context, it's very important for you to be able to include relevant Scottish knowledge and use Scottish examples where possible to back up the point that you are trying to make. For the British and European and World sections, the structure will look slightly different. Your last question in both of these parts of the paper will be an optional question. This means that you will have a choice of 2 questions and you can decide which one you would prefer to answer. On the screen in front of you, you can see an example of how this might look for your particular sections or contexts of the paper. For example, the last question in section 3 in the European and World context, the Cross and the Crescent, which is about the Crusades, might look similar to this. You will be asked to attempt either question 5A or question 5B. Question 5A, describe the Battle of Jaffa in 1192, or 5B, describe the role of the knight in medieval times. It's important to remember that while this is an optional question, you must answer one of the 2, but you have the choice to decide which one you would prefer to answer. Remember when you're completing your answer that you write carefully which question number you are attempting. At this point, we're just giving a reminder of the different question types that you can expect to see in your National 5 History exam. The knowledge questions are as follows: a describe question, which is worth 4 marks, an explain question, which is worth 6, and a 9-mark question. The 9-marker may have different question stems, which include to what extent, how important, or how successful. The source questions are evaluate the usefulness, which is worth 5 marks, how fully does source A describe or explain, which is worth 6 marks, and a compare the views, which is worth 4 marks. We're now going to look at each of the question types and what the SQA guidance is around approaching these. For your describe question, You can expect to see 2 of this question type in your question paper. Each should take you approximately 6 to 7 minutes to complete. When answering a describe question, it's important to remember that you should provide relevant and accurate facts which answer the question. A helpful structure for you to use could be the one that you see on the screen. Firstly, and then you would give your first knowledge point. Secondly, second knowledge point. Thirdly, your third knowledge point. And finally, your fourth knowledge point. We'll now begin looking at an explain question. There will be 3 of these in your question paper, which means that you can expect to see 1 explain question per section. So there'll be 1 in the Scottish section, 1 in the British section, and 1 in the European and World section. Each explain question should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete. Remember to keep an eye on your timing during your exam. You will only have 2 hours and 20 minutes to attempt all questions. When you're answering an explain question, it's important to remember that you need to give reasons and/or explanations, and it's not just about the facts. Your answer to an explain question must follow a particular structure. It's important to remember that you must link each point that you make to the question and offer a reason. You can access your full 6 marks by providing 6 separate, accurate and relevant explanations, or 3 explanations with developed points, or any combination of the 2. A helpful hint when dealing with an explain question is to remember that you should start each sentence with the words of the question, followed by because. At that point, you should introduce your point of knowledge and your explanation. This shows your marker that not only are you able to identify the fact, but you know what it means and you can relate it back to your question. Let's take a look at an explain answer. In the European and World context, using Part G, free at last, as an example, a question might ask for the reasons why many Black Americans migrated to the North. This is a common question. A relevant reason or a relevant answer might be, another reason why many Black Americans migrated to the North is because of better paid jobs. This sentence provides a clear link to the question where it says, many Black Americans migrated north because. The point about better paid jobs is identifying the reason. The next sentence then provides an explanation. This meant people would move there so they can get more money for their family. This shows your marker that you understand why better paid jobs would be a reason for Black Americans to migrate north. This is therefore an accurate and relevant reason which answers the question, and this point would receive 1 mark. We'll now look at a 9-mark question. In your paper, you will need to answer 2 9-mark questions. These can appear in any of the 3 sections that you have studied as part of your National 5 History course. It would be a good idea at this point to go back to the SQA past paper questions and have a look at some of the examples of previous 9-mark questions. The questions themselves should take you approximately 15 to 16 minutes each to complete. However, they may have slightly different question stems. They might ask how important, to what extent, or how successful. The structure for answering these questions is broadly the same, but remember that your content will change depending on the question itself. There will be certain skills that you need to demonstrate in every 9-mark question that you attempt. For these questions, you should write an introduction with either a background sentence or sentences or an outline of at least 2 factors. What this means is that you can pick up your mark for your introduction either by providing a point of background knowledge or by listing the factors that you're going to be discussing in your 9-mark answer. Your 9-mark answer should also follow a structure which contains at least 2 factors to provide balance. An easy way for you to pick up balance for these factors is by ensuring that you provide a link to the question at the start of each knowledge point. The knowledge points themselves should provide relevant and factual points of knowledge for each of the factors. Remember that there's 5 marks available for knowledge, so this can be 5 straightforward points or a combination of straightforward facts and developed points. Your 9-mark answer should also include a conclusion. Your conclusion should answer the question directly, whether this is an isolated factor question or a judgment question. You should also provide a reason that supports your conclusion. This can be knowledge that you have already mentioned as part of your 9-mark answer. Let's take a look at an example of a 9-mark question. This has been taken from the SQA 2018 paper from the British section, and it's Part E, The Making of Modern Britain. The question itself: to what extent were free school meals the most successful of the liberal reforms for the young? We'll now take a look at an example of a 9-mark introduction. The question itself you have already seen. To what extent were the free school meals the most successful of the liberal reforms for the young? This introduction answers the question and provides at least 2 factors. There were many successful liberal reforms for the young. Free school meals was an important reform, but there were also other important reforms such as the Children's Act. The first factor is free school meals. The second factor is the Children's Act. Therefore, 1 mark would be awarded for this introduction. On the screen in front of you, you will now see an example of a factor. You may want to pause the presentation at this point to allow you to read through the example on your own. In 1906, the Provision of School Meals Act was introduced, giving each local council the opportunity to serve free school meals to poor children. It was paid for through taxes and quickly became a huge success, as thousands of school children received free school meals. This factor in the first sentence would be awarded 1 mark for knowledge. This is a relevant and detailed historical knowledge point. The part that you see in italics shows where the candidate could have given a link to the question. By saying that the Act is a huge success and explaining the reason why, this has linked to the question and shown why this was a successful reform. On the screen in front of you, you can now see an example of a conclusion. The Provision of School Meals Act was the most successful liberal reform for the young, as it gave all poor children the chance to have 1 decent meal per day. Although this is a fairly short conclusion, we are still able to pick up 2 marks for this. 1 mark is awarded for the first part of the sentence, where it says the Provision of School Meals Act was the most successful liberal reform for the young. This gives a direct answer to the question. The second conclusion mark is given for the second half of that sentence, because we have a supporting reason that backs up the judgment. It says it gave all poor children the chance to have 1 decent meal per day. This is then an explanation of why the Free School Meals Act was the most successful liberal reform. We're now on to our source questions. and we'll begin with the how fully. When we think about the how fully question, you will be expected to deal with 3 how fullies as part of your exam. Just like they explain, there will be 1 how fully in each of the 3 sections that you have studied. Again, remember it's worth 6 marks. So this should take you approximately 10 to 11 minutes to complete. With your source questions, it would always be useful if you have a highlighter or a different colour of pen with you to allow you to underline your source points. Your how fully question starts with either how fully does source X describe or how fully does source X explain. There will be 2 how fully describes in your paper, and there will be 1 how fully explain. We'll now look at the different approaches for answering each of these different question stems. How fully describe and how fully explain will look really similar, but there's a really important distinction to make between the 2. When you're answering a how fully describe question, you're being asked to interpret relevant facts from the source and provide accurate and relevant facts in your recall. With the how fully explain, you're being asked to interpret accurate and relevant explanations. This is both interpreted points from the source and you have to give explanations in your recall knowledge. So it's not just about the facts. You have to give reasons in your how fully explain answer. It's particularly important in your how fully question that you interpret the points from the source. Remember where your marks are coming from in the first place. In a how fully question, the first thing that you will need to do is make a judgment on the source. You can do this through the following. Source X partly or to an extent, and then you would use the words of the question. Although you don't get a mark for that judgment, it means that the rest of the marks in your answer become available to you. Your second step is to interpret your points from the source, and you need to do this 3 times. You can either interpret through quoting and then explaining your quote, or by paraphrasing points from the source. Either method is perfectly acceptable, and your teacher will have advised you on the method that you have used in class. Once you have interpreted your points from the source, you must provide 3 relevant and accurate points of recalled knowledge. Remember, with a how fully describe question, this should just be facts, and with a how fully explain question, your recall must include explanations. Let's take a look at an example of how you can interpret the points from the source. If we look at the Scottish context, and we use migration and empire as an example, a how fully question might ask about the reasons for Scottish emigration from the Highlands. An interpreted source point might look like this. Source A says that there had been a total failure of the potato crop, and there is not any oatmeal to be had, which shows people left because they don't have enough food. In this case, you can see the quote and explain method. The candidate has given their initial quote from the source and introduced their explanation when they say which shows. The point that follows is the candidate showing that they understand what that quote means and why it's a reason that people would have to leave the Highlands. We'll now take a look at and evaluate the usefulness question. There will be 2 of these question types in your National 5 History exam, and they can appear in any section of the paper. Each question should take you approximately 8 to 9 minutes to complete. And just like with your how fully question, it's a good idea to underline your source points as you go. You may also want to underline your author, timing, and type of source, because this will help to direct your attention when you begin to complete your answer. With your Evaluate the Usefulness questions, you will have one question based on a primary source. This means it's a source that has been taken from the time of a historical event. You will also have one question based on a secondary source. This is a source that has been produced after a historical event has taken place. In this answer, you must provide an evaluative comment on different aspects of the source. It's worth 5 marks, and you can pick up your marks in a number of ways, through evaluative comments on content, source omission, author, timing, type, or the purpose of the source. Your teacher will have shown you the areas of this particular question that you should focus on. Let's take a look at possible comments that you could provide when answering an Evaluate the Usefulness question. Remember that these are only possible comments, and it's likely that your teacher will have given you additional comments that you can make when answering this source question. You will have 1 mark available for authorship. If the author is someone who was there, usually this person is useful because they were an eyewitness who saw whatever the event is that you're being asked about. Sometimes the author may not be useful, and it really depends on the source and the historical event that you're being asked about. If the person is a historian, generally this is useful because the person is an expert who will have good historical knowledge about whatever the historical event is, and it's important that you try and name the event. For your timing, 1 mark is also available for this. If the source is a primary source, it will usually be useful because it has been taken from the time of, and you name the event. It's not enough to say it's useful because it's taken from the time of the event. You have to name what the event actually is. If the source is a secondary source, then usually it's useful because it's been written with the value of hindsight. This means that the author has looked back on lots of different sources of information before producing that particular source. The different types of source can be varied. On the screen in front of you, you will see a couple of examples of types of source, but there's lots more that are available. If the source is a textbook, it tends to be useful because it's likely to have been well researched. This means that the information tends to be more accurate and less biased. If the source is an interview, it tends to be useful because it's more likely to contain honest and accurate information. The purpose of the source is usually only to influence or to inform. Just as with type of source, there is 1 mark available for identifying the purpose and explaining why it is or is not useful. If a source has been produced to influence the reader, this tends to make it less useful because it may contain evidence of bias. However, on the other hand, it could be argued that this is also more useful because it provides an accurate representation of attitudes at the time. Your comment will obviously vary depending on the source, which is why it's important to make sure that you're reading the question and the sources very carefully before beginning your answer. If a source has been produced to inform the reader, this tends to be useful because it is likely to contain accurate, balanced information. Remember that when you're answering any Evaluate the Usefulness question, you must identify the point from the source, give a comment on its usefulness, and an explanation as to why. This applies to content, source omission, and any other aspect of the source that you are deciding to comment on. We're now going to take a look at a couple of examples of authorship. In the European and world context, using Part G, free at last, as an example, a question might ask about the usefulness of a source as evidence of the experience of Black Americans during World War II. A good evaluative comment on the author of the secondary source could be, source C is useful as it was written by a modern historian who is an expert on World War II. Here we can see the candidate has commented on whether the source is useful. They have identified the point from the source by saying it's written by a modern historian, and then their explanation of why this is useful. The historian is an expert on World War II. Here we see an example of a possible comment for the author of a primary source. Using the Making of Modern Britain as an example, a question might ask about the usefulness of a source as evidence of the effectiveness of the liberal reforms. An evaluative comment on the author of a primary source like this could be, it was written by the Prime Minister, so it may be less useful as he has a personal interest in making the reforms sound successful. In this case, the candidate had identified the point from the source, which is saying that the source was written by the Prime Minister. They have also given an evaluative comment. They have argued that the source is less useful. They have then given a good explanation of why they have made that evaluative comment. They've said he has a personal interest in making the reforms sound successful. We can now take a look at the source omissions. Omissions should also include evaluative comments on what the source fails to mention. If we look at the Atlantic slave trade as an example, a question might ask about the usefulness of a source as evidence of the slave factories. A good evaluative comment could be, source B fails to mention that slaves were almost always shackled, making it less useful. In this case, the candidate has said the source is less useful and then given an explanation of what the source fails to mention. We're now going to turn to our last source question, which is compare the views. This is an entirely skills-based question. Your knowledge will help you to understand what the sources are about and make it easier to identify the comparisons. But you will not need to use recalled knowledge at any point of your answer here. There will be 2 of this question type in your paper, and just like the describe and evaluate the usefulness and your 9 marker, they can appear in any section of the paper. Each question should take you approximately 6 or 7 minutes to complete. It's very important in this case that you read the sources carefully, because they may agree or disagree with each other. By reading the sources carefully, this will help you to identify the areas of agreement or disagreement quicker. A helpful hint for dealing with a comparison question is, where possible, using highlighters or a different colour of pen or pencil when you read the comparison sources. This is going to help you identify the points that match up with each other. On the screen in front of you, you can now see a suggested structure for how you answer this particular question. You may use a slightly different structure when in class, but the one on the screen gives you an idea of where your marks are actually coming from. For this question, we would encourage you to use the following structure. Step 1 is when you identify whether the sources agree or disagree. There is 1 mark available for your overall comparison, and you should structure it as follows. Sources A and B agree or disagree about, and you use the words of the question. For step 2, you then refer to the sources. Source A says, and you give your quote. Source B either agrees or disagrees when it says, and you give your second quote. This is also worth 1 mark. Please remember that when you're giving your second quote, that you remember to tell us if the sources agree or disagree. This reinforces the comparison. Step 3 is worth 1 mark as well, where you sum up the comparison from the sources. You should remind yourself of what the two quotes are and what they agree or disagree about before you write your summary sentence. You could introduce it like this. This proves that sources A and B agree or disagree about, and you use the area of comparison in the sources. You need to repeat steps 2 and 3 to access the full range of marks for this question. Read quickly and carefully to identify your points of comparison. We've now looked at all of the possible question types that you could be examined on in your National 5 History exam. Some key things to remember about these questions. Keep a close eye on your timing. You'll have 2 hours and 20 minutes for your exam. You want to be able to attempt all 14 questions to give you the best possible chance of success. As far as possible, try to avoid leaving any of them out and attempt all 14 from the 3 sections that you have studied. Remember to read your questions carefully. There will be clues in the question, and it's there to guide you, not to confuse you. Highlight any key points that you think would be important in helping to direct your attention when you're answering the question itself. Remember that when you're answering the question, if in doubt, always give a specific example to back up the point that you're making. This is particularly important for you in the Scottish section, where it's crucial that you provide specific Scottish examples of knowledge. On the screen in front of you, you can now see some useful links to help with your next part of your studying. The first is a QR code, which will take you to the BBC Bite Size National 5 History website. This is quite a useful website for looking at summary information and just reminding yourself of some of the key facts on the topics that you have studied. The second QR code opens up the Forth Valley and West Lothian RIC YouTube channel, and it shows some of your exam support videos for a range of different subject options. We would encourage you to use both of these resources when preparing for your final exam. Next steps and key things to consider. It would be useful for you to access the SQA specimen paper to see the range of question types for each of the units that you have studied. The link for this can be seen on the screen in front of you. Remember that all of the key information shared in today's presentation can also be accessed using the SQA website study guide. The link for this is on the screen, which is the 2022 Revision Support for Learners for National 5 History. The final point for today is just to wish all of you good luck, to say thank you for listening to me throughout this session, and I wish you all the best for your National 5 History exam. Good luck, guys.